August 17th, 1945. A mountainside scorched to black soot 10 kilometers, about 6 miles north of the place where the city of Nagasaki once stood. The air shimmers with heat, but it is not the heat of summer, but the smoldering, sick breath of a desecrated earth. 5 men, their faces half hidden by dirty rags, lie in the shadow of a charred rock outcropping. Their skin, once white, has become a sallow, parchment-like yellow. Their eyes gleam with fever in their sunken faces. They are the ghosts of Europeans in the heart of a Japanese apocalypse. Lieutenant Hendrik van der Meer, a hydro engineer from Utrecht, looked at his hands. They were trembling. Not from weakness, although hunger had become a constant gnawing beast chewing at him from the inside, but from the strain, from the endless burden of decisions made. 8 days. Just 8 days ago. They were prisoners of the Empire. Now, they were nobody. Free in hell. Lying beside him, barely breathing, was Joris, a 19-year-old radio operator from The Hague. His young face had become a mask of suffering, and strange, dark spots were appearing on his skin. He was delirious, whispering something about tulip fields and the North Sea. Hendrik knew what it was. He didn't know the name of the sickness, but he had seen its effect. An invisible fire that was burning the boy from within. He had already buried 2 men, without prayers, without ceremony, just burying the bodies in shallow graves marked with a stone, so that later, someday, he could return. A foolish thought. No one would ever return here. This land was cursed. He raised his eyes to the others. Old Sergeant Dan, a veteran of the First World War, was silently sharpening a knife on a stone. His face was as impenetrable as the shell of an ancient tortoise. He had survived Ypres and the Somme, but even he had never seen anything like this. Willem, an elderly chemical engineer, was drawing something in the dust with a stick. Formulas. Diagrams. He was trying to explain the unexplainable, to find logic in the madness. And Peter sat a little way off, staring in the direction where a dirty yellow haze hung over the horizon. He was one of those who hadn't listened to Hendrik, one of the few who had returned from the city. But he had returned changed. His eyes were empty, and he barely spoke. He had seen what a man should not see. How had they come to this? How had the prison they hated with every cell of their bodies turned into a memory of safety, of order, of paradise? How had the freedom they dreamed of during sleepless nights become their greatest curse? Every sip of water was a risk. Every piece of root they ate could carry an invisible death. And every night they heard screams. Inhuman screams from the scorched villages where the few surviving Japanese were going mad from pain and grief, seeing in every stranger a demon who had brought the sky down to earth. Hendrik closed his eyes. There was a ringing in his ears, a quiet, low hum that never stopped. It was the sound of a dying world. But to understand how engineers from civilized Holland had turned into a primitive tribe hiding in the radioactive mountains, one must go back 8 days, to that very day, August 9th, 1945, to the moment when the sun rose twice in the sky, August 9th, 1945. Fukuoka 2 POW camp, located in the valley of the Urakami River, a few kilometers, a couple of miles, from the industrial districts of Nagasaki. The morning began like 1,000 other mornings in captivity, with the clang of a rusty rail hanging from a post. That sound, sharp and lifeless, was the metronome of their existence. It measured time that stretched on like a thick, dirty sludge. The air was already heavy and humid, promising another suffocating day. The Dutch engineers captured during the fall of Java slowly rose from their bunks. 3 years. For 3 years they had built docks and repaired ships for their enemies. Their knowledge, which had once built bridges and dams, now served a war they despised. Hendrik van der Meer, a lieutenant by rank and an engineer by calling, was already standing in the middle of the barracks. He was their informal leader, not because he was the strongest or the loudest, but because, even here, in this hell, His mind continued to work with the cold precision of a machine. He drew diagrams in his head, calculated loads, analyzed. It saved him from madness. He looked at his men. Emaciated bodies covered in sores from vitamin deficiency, eyes in which hope had been extinguished. But they held on. They were Dutch, stubborn, pragmatic. They had created their own system of survival. Willem, the brilliant chemist, had learned to make a semblance of soap from fish guts and wood ash, which saved them from rampant dysentery. Don, the old sergeant who knew everything about discipline, maintained order in the barracks, preventing despair from turning them into a pack of snarling dogs. Joris, the young radio operator, recounted the news every evening, which he managed to hear in fragments from Korean laborers at the docks. The news was good. Germany had fallen. The Americans were already on Okinawa. It seemed the end of the tunnel was near. But here, in the heart of Japan, the war felt eternal. The morning gruel, a murky liquid with bits of seaweed, was, as always, disgusting. But they ate. Slowly. Methodically. It was fuel. Not food. Today they were to work at the Mitsubishi shipyard, unloading steel beams. Hard, mindless work under the scorching sun and the shouts of the guards. Peter, a young engineer captured almost immediately after graduating from university, grumbled, "How much longer? How much longer are we going to build these tubs for them, just for the Americans to sink them a week later?" Hendrik put a hand on his shoulder. "As long as we work, we are alive, Peter. As long as we think, we are men. Focus on that." He said it often. It was their mantra. They marched in formation down a dusty road surrounded by guards with rifles. The camp was in a valley, and the path to the shipyard led over a small pass that offered a view of Nagasaki. The city breathed, lived its own life. Trams, factories, school children in identical uniforms. A peaceful city that was part of a huge war machine. Somewhere beyond the hills there were anti-aircraft batteries. Sometimes they heard air raid sirens, but there were almost no bombings. It was said that the Americans were saving Nagasaki for something special. It was one of those camp legends born of fear and ignorance. 11 o'clock in the morning. The sky was almost cloudless, with only a few light, feathery clouds. Suddenly an air raid siren sounded over the city. But a different one. Not the usual wailing sound. A short, staccato one. The guards bustled about, herding them into shelters, but they did it sluggishly, without enthusiasm. Everyone was used to the alarms being mostly false. A lone reconnaissance plane would fly over, and that was it. And indeed, only a single silver dot appeared in the piercing blue of the sky. Too high. Not dangerous. Hendrik watched it, squinting. Something was wrong. Some sixth sense, an engineer's instinct for anomalies, was screaming at him. He didn't yet know that this plane, a B-29 named Boxcar, carried something in its belly that would change not only their fate, but the fate of all humanity. He didn't know that in a moment, the concepts of city, war, and life would lose all meaning for him. He just looked at the sky, unaware that the impact he was about to hear would not be the thud of a shell hitting the ground, but a silent blow that fractured time itself. 11:02 in the morning. The silver dot in the sky they had been watching suddenly blinked. No, not blinked. It spat something dark out of itself. Another dot which began to fall rapidly. Hendrik instinctively ducked, though reason told him that bombing their valley from such a height was impossible. The target was the city. But then the strangest thing happened. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No whistle. No explosion. The dot simply vanished, as if it had dissolved in the air above the city. The guards relaxed. One even laughed, pointing a finger at the sky. A misfire. A failure for the Americans. The prisoners also began to stir, raising their heads. And in that moment, the world ceased to exist. First, There was the flash. Not a flash, no. That word is too weak, too mundane. Imagine that the sun was not rising in the sky, but was born directly inside your eyes. A white, unbearable, absolute light that bleached out all colors, all shadows, all reality. It was silent. In that fraction of a second, all the sounds of the world disappeared. The chirping of cicadas, the shouts of the guards, even the beating of one's own heart. Only the light remained. Hendrik managed to squeeze his eyes shut and fall to the ground, covering his head with his arms. It was a reflex, an instinct that saved his life. Those who continued to look at the city saw something indescribable. A second, man-made dawn was blooming over Nagasaki. A huge fireball, brighter than 1,000 suns, was devouring the sky. And then came the wave of heat. Not like from a fire or a furnace. It was a wave that seemed to vaporize the very air. The skin on exposed parts of the body instantly turned red, as if from a severe sunburn. Clothing began to smolder. And only after that, after an eternity that lasted no more than a few seconds, did the sound return. But it was not the sound of an explosion. It was the roar of a universe being born. A low, all-pervading rumble that came not from any specific direction, but from everywhere at once. From under the ground, from the sky, from within one's own body. It pressed on the eardrums, making every bone vibrate. And after it came the shockwave. Their camp, located in the valley, was shielded from the direct light and heat radiation by a ridge of hills. This is what saved them. The wave came not directly but rolled over the peaks like a gigantic invisible ocean wave. The air compressed into a solid wall and struck. The wooden barracks collapsed like houses of cards. The flimsy barbed wire fences were torn from the ground, posts and all. The guards standing in the open were simply swept away like dust. Hendrik saw one of them flying through the air, tumbling like a rag doll and hitting a cliff. The crunch of bones was audible even through the deafening roar. Hendrik himself felt as if he were lifted into the air and dragged several meters along the ground, his face and hands scraped by stones. When everything fell silent, a dead, unnatural quiet descended. The air was filled with dust, smoke, and a strange, ozone-like smell, like after a severe thunderstorm. Hendrik raised his head. The world had changed. The sky, which had just been blue, was now a sick, dirty orange color. And over the city, where Nagasaki should have been, a monster was growing. A gigantic mushroom of boiling clouds of dust and smoke, rising higher and higher, obscuring the sun. Its stalk glowed from within with a ghastly crimson light. The prisoners slowly rose from the ground. They were in shock. Someone was crying. Someone was laughing hysterically. They were dazed, covered in soot and dust, but most of them were alive. And the guards were dead. Every single one. Some were killed by flying debris. Some were simply crushed by their own structures. They were free. The fence that had separated them from the world for 3 years had ceased to exist. The gates were torn from their hinges. Their prison was destroyed. But freedom had come in the guise of apocalypse. Hendrik looked at his men, at their frightened, bewildered faces, then at the mushroom cloud continuing to spread across the sky. And in that moment he understood. If they wanted to survive, he had to become more than just their commander. He had to become their law, their order, and their hope in a world where all of that had just died. The first few minutes after the blast were filled with a kind of ominous, stunned silence. The wind died down, as if frightened by what it had done. The air was thick with dust. It was hard to breathe, and there was a taste of chalk and cinders in the mouth. The prisoners, staggering like drunks, wandered through the ruins of their camp. Their movements were slow, inhibited, as if they were at the bottom of the ocean. The shock had not yet worn off, had not given way to either fear or joy. They touched their bodies, checking if they were whole, looked at their trembling hands, and then raised their eyes to the terrible mushroom in the sky, and could not believe it. It was too grand, too monstrous to be real. It felt like a bad dream. Hendrik was the first to come to his senses. His engineer's mind, accustomed to analyzing disasters and destruction, had already begun to work. He cast aside emotions, leaving only cold calculation. First, they were alive. Second, the guards were dead. They were free. Third, they were at the epicenter of something incredible and deadly. He looked around, quickly assessing the situation. The barracks were destroyed. The food storage was buried under rubble. The guards' armory, a small stone building, had miraculously survived, though the door had been blown out. The bodies of 2 sentries lay near it. "Everyone! To me!" His voice sounded hoarse but firm. He cleared his throat, spitting a clump of dusty saliva onto the ground. "Check everyone. Who's injured? Sound off." The men slowly began to gather around him, as if he were a beacon in this chaos. Willem, the old chemist, was helping Joris up, who seemed to have hit his head hard. Don, the sergeant, was already examining the guards' bodies, efficiently taking their canteens and ammo pouches. The war had taught him the main rule: the dead don't need things. It turned out there were almost no serious injuries. Bruises, scrapes. Someone had a dislocated arm. The hills and the camp's location in the basin had been their armor, their shield. But it was at that very moment that the unity that had held them together for all these years showed its first crack. Peter, young and hot-headed, jumped onto a piece of a wall, his eyes burning with a mad fire. "We're free!" he shouted, throwing his hands to the sky. "Do you understand? Free! Their city is burning. Their army is dead. We've won." Several men echoed his cry. Their voices held a euphoria, an intoxication that comes to a man who has broken out of prison. "There's food in the city," Peter continued. "Clothes. Maybe even weapons. We have to go there. We'll take everything they owe us for these 3 years." His words fell on fertile ground. Hungry, exhausted men who had dreamed of revenge saw justice in his words. But Hendrik saw something else. He looked at the billowing column of smoke and dust over the city, at the strange black rain that had begun to fall from the sky, leaving greasy, sticky spots on the skin. His engineer's instinct screamed of danger. This was no ordinary weapon. This was something new, something that kills not only with an explosion, but with something else, something invisible. "Halt!" His voice cracked like a whip. "No one is going anywhere!" Peter turned around, his face contorted with anger. "Who are you to give us orders, Vandermeer? We're not in the army anymore. We're free men." "It is precisely because we are free that we must think," Hendrik replied calmly, though everything was boiling inside him. "Look at that. Do you think there's anything left there but death? We don't know what it was. But I know one thing. We must stay as far away from there as possible. Our path is into the mountains, to the north, away from this place." The crowd began to murmur. Some supported Peter, others, more cautious, leaned toward Hendrik's opinion. At that moment, their small society split. Don walked up to Hendrik. In his hands was a Japanese Arisaka rifle taken from a dead guard. He silently handed it to the lieutenant. It was a sign that the old hierarchy still existed. Hendrik took the rifle. It was heavy and alien. "I'm not holding anyone back," he said, addressing them all. "Whoever wants to go to the city, go. But think. For 3 years we survived because we were together and listened to each other. Don't let the first day of freedom be your last." About 20 men, inspired by Peter, would not listen. Drunk on freedom, they rushed with shouts and laughter toward the city, toward the gigantic funeral pyre. A little more than a dozen remained. The most cautious, the most sensible, or the most frightened. They looked at Hendrik, waiting for a decision. The black rain was getting heavier. It stained their clothes, ran down their faces, and a faint, nauseating smell emanated from it. Hendrik realized they couldn't delay. Willem Dan, gather all the canteens. Fill them with water from the well before this filth gets into it. The rest of you, to the armory. We take everything we can carry, ammunition, grenades, the first aid kit, and food. Everything we can find. We have 15 minutes. In that moment, they ceased to be prisoners. They became a unit of survivors. But they did not yet know that their main enemy was no longer the Japanese. Their enemy was invisible. It was in the air they breathed, in the water they would drink, and in the earth they walked upon. Having climbed into the mountains, they first encountered an enemy far more ancient and ruthless than the Japanese army: thirst. The water supplies they had managed to collect in the camp were quickly running out. Every sip was worth its weight in gold, and Hendrik established the strictest discipline. But it wasn't enough. The streams they found carried water of a strange, murky color with that same nauseating taste of cinders. To drink it was tantamount to suicide, and everyone understood this. After 2 days of agonizing travel, when their tongues were swollen and their heads were foggy, despair began to take hold. They lay in the shade of the rocks, exhausted, and looked at Hendrik with silent reproach. He had led them here, into this waterless wasteland, saving them from an invisible threat. But now they were dying of a very tangible thirst. Joris, the youngest, was already delirious, his lips cracked and bleeding. Hendrik felt his authority melting away with every hour. He tried to think, to analyze, but his dehydrated and exhausted brain refused to work. He was a hydro engineer, a specialist in water, and he was dying of thirst. The irony was monstrous. It seemed it was all over. They had escaped a quick death from the explosion, only to die a slow and torturous death here. But it was at that moment that the quiet, almost unnoticeable Willem, the chemical engineer who had been muttering to himself and collecting some pebbles all this time, approached Hendrik. "Lieutenant," he rasped, "I think I have an idea. It's crazy, but it might just work." He pointed to a layered rock formation nearby. "That's sandstone, porous. Lower down at the base, there should be a layer of clay. And the wood. The wood is turned to charcoal." At first, Hendrik didn't understand. It sounded like the ramblings of a dying man. But Willem continued, his eyes lit with a spark of scientific excitement. "Filtration, Lieutenant. Natural, multi-stage filtration. We can build our own filter, from improvised materials, from the ashes of this world." The idea was as brilliant as it was desperate. Using mess tins, perforated helmets, and pieces of their tunics, they set to work under Willem's guidance. It was their first creative work in 3 years. They were not building a weapon of death for the enemy. They were building a machine of life for themselves. Dan, with his strong hands, crushed the sandstone. Others collected charcoal from burnt tree trunks. Willem himself, like a priest, laid out the layers in their makeshift filter. First coarse stones, then smaller ones, then a thick layer of charcoal, then crushed sandstone, and fabric on top. When the construction was ready, the moment of truth arrived. Hendrik, overcoming his disgust, scooped up some of the murky, foul-smelling water from the stream with a mess tin and slowly poured it into the filter. Everyone froze, holding their breath. The water slowly, reluctantly, seeped through the layers. Drop by drop, an eternity seemed to pass. And then, from the hole in the bottom of the helmet that served as the filter's base, the first drop appeared. It fell onto Hendrik's outstretched palm, clean, transparent, odorless. A second followed, then a third. They looked at this thin stream of clean water as if it were a miracle. This was their first victory. A victory not of weapons, but of knowledge. A victory of the human mind over blind chaos. They drank, not greedily but slowly, with reverence, feeling the life-giving moisture return to their tormented bodies. The taste of this water was the taste of hope. They had conquered thirst. On that day, they understood the most important thing. Their prison had taught them how to survive, and their knowledge, which had seemed useless in the hell of war, had become their main and only weapon. They looked at their quiet genius, Willem, with new respect. He was not a soldier, but he had just saved them all. But they did not yet know that by solving one problem, they had created another. Their small oasis, their source of life in this scorched wasteland, would very soon attract the attention of other survivors. Those who were not as smart, but were far more hungry and desperate. The discovery of a water source changed everything. It was not just a physical salvation. It was a powerful psychological boost. The despair that had begun to eat away at their souls receded. In its place came a grim, businesslike resolve. They were no longer refugees fleeing a catastrophe. They had become colonists on a new, hostile planet. Under Hendrik's leadership, they began to organize their lives, creating their own small, self-sufficient empire of ashes. They chose a cave hidden in the rocks as the site for their new camp, not far from their life-saving filter. It provided shelter from the scorching sun during the day, from the cold at night, and most importantly, from prying eyes. Hendrik, using his engineering mindset, turned survival into a system, a set of clear laws and rules. He was the brain of this new civilization done, with his iron discipline became its hands, and Willem, its scientific center. The first law was the law of water. Water was the most valuable asset. A strict daily ration per person was established. Every drop was accounted for. Damaging the filter or attempting to take water beyond the ration was punishable by severe measures, up to and including exile, which in their circumstances was equivalent to a death sentence. The second law was the law of the centuries. 2 men stood guard around the clock on top of the cliff, observing the surroundings. They feared not so much the Americans, but other surviving Japanese who might be wandering the mountains. A daily routine was established. Rise at dawn, morning inspection, distribution of tasks. Some went with Dan on a hunt, searching for edible roots and berries which the old sergeant somehow managed to find even on this scorched earth. Others were responsible for maintaining the filter, cleaning the charcoal, replacing the sandstone. Still others fortified the entrance to the cave, building a barricade of stones. Idleness was forbidden. Labor became a medicine for fear and madness. Joris, who was recovering from his concussion, became their chronicler. He found a charred notebook and a stub of a pencil, and every day he wrote down everything that happened. This was important. It preserved their history, proved that they were still men, not feral animals. Their small state gave them more than just physical resources. It gave them meaning. In a world where absolute chaos reigned, they had created their own island of order. Their cave became their fortress, their Noah's Ark. In the evenings, they would gather around a small, carefully concealed fire. They ate a meager meal, baked roots and bitter berries, but it was their food, obtained by their labor. And they talked. They remembered home, families, a peaceful life. These conversations were as important an element of survival as water or food. They prevented them from forgetting who they were. Hendrik looked at them and felt a sense of pride. He had saved them. He had established order. He had become a rock for them against which the waves of despair crashed. But this firmness had a downside. He was becoming increasingly rigid, authoritarian. He did not consult but commanded. He did not tolerate arguments. He perceived any doubt in his words as a threat to the survival of the entire group. He was becoming a tyrant, albeit an enlightened one. And this growing organization, this stability they had built, was bound to lead to the first serious internal conflict. The system worked, but not everyone was prepared to live by its laws. In the darkness of the cave and the whispers by the dying fire, discontent began to brew. A rebellion began to ripen. Their harsh but predictable world lasted for almost a week. It seemed they had adapted. They had learned to live in the new reality, almost getting used to the constant taste of ash in their mouths and the crimson sky above their heads. But human nature is complex. The discipline that saved them was also oppressive. The constant tension, the meager food, and the lack of any certainty about the future eroded their spirits more than radiation did their bodies. And the discontent found its leader. It was not the hot-headed Peter, who had never returned from the city, but a man named Klaus. Before the war, he had been a successful merchant, a pragmatic man accustomed to measuring everything in terms of profit and risk. He was not a coward or a panic monger. He was the embodiment of cold, selfish common sense. He approached Hendrik one evening as he stood alone on watch duty. "Hendrik, we need to talk," he began without preamble. His voice was calm and rational. "Your system worked. You saved us from thirst. We are grateful. But what's next? We're sitting in this hole, eating roots. The supplies are running out. Don can't find anything new anymore. We are slowly starving to death." Hendrik silently gazed at the valley, where a haze still hung over the ruins of Nagasaki. "We wait. We fortify our position. We make sorties," he replied. "The war will be over soon. The Americans will come. They will find us." Klaus chuckled. "Find us? Who's going to look for us? We're a handful of Dutchmen in the heart of Japan. We were written off 3 years ago. And even if they do find us, when? In a month? In 6 months? We won't survive that long." "What do you suggest?" Hendrik asked, already sensing where the conversation was heading. "The coast," Klaus said, gesturing east with the edge of his hand. "It's over there. A couple of days' journey. There might be fishing villages, boats, food, a chance to get off this cursed island. Yes, it's a risk. But sitting here is a guaranteed death. Your tactic is the tactic of the besieged, and I don't want to die under siege." His words were logical. They were seductive. They appealed to what everyone wanted: action, hope for a quick rescue. And Klaus didn't stop with Hendrik. He began talking to the others. At night, when the lieutenant slept, he gathered the discontented around him, convincing them he was right. He didn't call for open rebellion. He acted more cunningly, like a merchant offering a better deal. Hendrik felt the atmosphere in the camp changing. The men became sullen, looking at him with doubt. His orders were carried out reluctantly. Their little empire was cracking at the seams. The climax came 2 days later. In the morning, Klaus and 4 other men announced they were leaving. They had gathered their share of water and food and were ready to set off. This was a direct challenge to Hendrik's authority. If he let them leave, his authority would be destroyed. The group would disintegrate, and they would all perish one by one. Hendrik stood in their way, clutching his rifle. "You're not going anywhere. You can't stop us," Klaus said. "This is our choice." "Your choice is betrayal," Hendrik replied coldly. "Betrayal of those who stay. We will only survive together." The tension reached its peak. Klaus's men stood behind him, ready for a fight. The others watched in silence, not knowing whose side to take. And then Hendrik applied what he would later call surgical cruelty. He didn't threaten or shoot. He lowered his rifle and said, "Fine, go. But you will leave everything behind. The water, the food, the clothes, all of it belongs to the community. You will leave as you were born." Klaus and his men froze in astonishment. This was monstrous. To set off into the unknown without a single sip of water was equivalent to immediate death. "You can't. That's inhuman," Klaus cried out. "War is inhuman," Hendrik replied, his eyes like 2 chips of ice. "And I will not let your selfishness destroy our only chance. The choice is yours. Stay and obey the laws, or leave and die." It was a cruel but brilliant move. Hendrik had presented them with a choice not between freedom and submission, but between life and death. The mutiny was quashed before it could even begin. Klaus, realizing he had lost, threw his pack to the ground in fury. His men followed his example. Hendrik had defended his law. He had preserved the unity of the group. but the price was high. He had broken their will using fear. From that day on, they not only respected him, but also feared him. But while they were dealing with their internal conflicts, while their little world was shaken by internal strife, they failed to notice that they were being watched. Their real enemy, an enemy of flesh and blood, was already preparing to strike. The victory over the internal enemy came at a heavy price for Hendrik. He had maintained order, but the atmosphere in the cave had become oppressive. A silent tension hung in the air. Klaas and his supporters had submitted, but resentment festered in their eyes. Hendrik knew it couldn't go on like this for long. They needed a new goal, a new hope, to unite them again. And fate, as if hearing his unspoken prayer, threw the most terrible trial of all at them. On the 8th day of their life in the mountains, the sentry on the cliff let out an alarmed cry. But it was not a cry about an approaching enemy. It was a cry of astonishment and disbelief. Hendrik, grabbing his rifle, was the first to climb up. What he saw made his heart stop. A small group of men was walking slowly, staggering along the valley floor. 7 of them. Judging by the remnants of their uniforms, they were Japanese soldiers. But what soldiers? They looked like the walking dead from a horror story. Their clothes hung on them in tatters. Their faces were covered with burns and sores. One of them walked leaning on his rifle like a crutch. Another was being supported by his comrades. They were in as desperate a situation as the Dutchman, or even worse. They were following the bed of a dried-up stream, obviously in search of water, and their path was leading them inexorably straight to the place where the filter was hidden. "What do we do, Lieutenant?" the sentry whispered. Hendrik's heart was torn. On the one hand, he saw before him not enemies, but fellow victims of this monstrous catastrophe. Maimed, dying men. Humanity, the remnants of his European upbringing, demanded he help them, share water, bandage their wounds. But on the other hand, his cold leader's mind said something else. Their water source was their only hope of survival. If the Japanese found it, they would stay. They wouldn't leave. And then there wouldn't be enough water for everyone. Or worse, maddened by pain and rage, they would simply kill the Dutchman to seize the water. It was a monstrous choice. Mercy or survival. While he agonized over the decision, the Japanese came very close, and one of them noticed. He noticed the wet stones, the thin trickles seeping from under the ground. He let out a hoarse, joyful cry and rushed forward, falling to his knees and pressing his lips to the earth. The others followed him. They had found their oasis. A decision had to be made immediately. And at that moment, a tragic accident occurred that sealed the outcome. Joris, young and inexperienced, who was on duty next to Hendrik, stumbled in his excitement and dislodged a stone. A small stone, but in the ringing silence, its clatter sounded like a gunshot. The Japanese instantly snapped their heads up, and they saw them. They saw the silhouettes of men on the cliff. White men. In their minds, distorted by pain and shock, everything fell into one terrible picture. Their city was destroyed. Their families were dead. And here, in the mountains, the ones who did this were hiding. Pale-faced demons. American commandos. One of the Japanese soldiers, the one with the rifle, without thinking, raised it and fired. The bullet struck the rock next to Hendrik's head, showering him with stone fragments. There was no longer a choice. "Fire!" Hendrik screamed, and it was a cry of desperation. The fight began. The most absurd, most tragic fight imaginable. A handful of exhausted Dutch prisoners armed with captured rifles firing from the top of a cliff. And below, at the water source, a handful of dying Japanese soldiers were firing back. Two groups of victims blinded by fear and misunderstanding were killing each other. The fight was short and brutal. The Japanese, weakened and in an exposed position, were doomed. They fell one by one, but before dying, one of them managed to fire an accurate burst from his submachine gun. Joris, who was standing at his full height, cried out and fell. The bullet had hit him squarely in the chest. When the last Japanese soldier fell, silence descended. A terrible, crushing silence broken only by the groans of the dying Joris. Hendrik ran to him, but it was too late. The boy was looking at the sky and whispering something about his mother. A minute later, he was dead. They had won. They had defended their water, but the price of this victory was terrible. They had killed men who were victims just like themselves, and they had lost their youngest comrade. At that moment, something broke inside Hendrik. He looked at his hands, holding the smoking rifle, then at the bodies below, and realized that the atomic blast had not only destroyed the city, it had destroyed something inside them, something called humanity. And then, in the ensuing silence, the sentry on the other side of the cliff cried out. But it was not a cry of horror or astonishment. It was a cry of incredible, impossible hope. The sentry's cry sounded like a thunderclap in the dead silence that had fallen. For a moment, everyone froze, stunned by the grief of Joris's loss and the horror of what they had done. But the cry came again, and this time, there was no doubt in it. Vehicles in the valley, with white stars. Hendrik, leaving Joris's body, rushed to the other edge of the cliff. His heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it would break through his ribs. He looked down, and indeed a column of 3 vehicles was moving along the distant road, raising clouds of dust. "Jeeps," someone whispered nearby. And on the hoods, white 5-pointed stars were clearly visible. Americans. Rescue. It was so incredible, so untimely, that it seemed like a hallucination. All the feelings they had experienced in the last few minutes, rage, fear, grief, were instantly replaced by euphoria. They shouted, hugged, cried. They waved their arms, trying to attract attention. Don, the old soldier, tore off the remnants of his shirt and tying it to his rifle turned it into a white flag. Rescue had come. Their nightmare was over. Half an hour later, the American patrol found them. Soldiers in clean uniforms with Thompson submachine guns at the ready cautiously made their way up the slope. They saw a strange scene. A group of ragged, emaciated Europeans waving a white flag, and at their feet, the fresh corpses of Japanese soldiers and the body of a dead blonde boy. The first few minutes of communication were chaotic. The Dutchmen, tripping over their words, tried to explain who they were. The patrol was commanded by a young lieutenant with tired eyes. He listened to them, his expression growing more disbelieving and suspicious. He saw before him a group of armed white men, deep behind enemy lines, next to the bodies of killed Japanese. The picture was, to say the least, strange. They were disarmed, loaded into the vehicles, and taken to a temporary American field post set up in an undamaged school on the outskirts of what was left of Nagasaki. And here, the euphoria of rescue finally gave way to bitter disappointment. They were placed not in a hospital, but in a separate room, under guard. Their first visitor was not a doctor, but an intelligence officer. The interrogations began. Hendrik, as the senior officer, told their story. He spoke of the camp, of the explosion that had freed them, of the split in the group, of the trek into the mountains, of the creation of the filter, and finally, of the tragic firefight. The more he spoke, the more stone-like the American captain's face became. The story was too incredible, too inconvenient. "So you claim that you were liberated by our bomb?" the captain asked again. "Yes, sir." "And then you engaged in combat with surviving soldiers of the Japanese army?" "They attacked first. They mistook us for you, for commandos." The captain leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. His eyes showed a hatred not for Hendrik, but for the situation that had been dumped on his head. The official picture of victory that the command was painting was simple and clean. The Americans delivered a devastating blow with a new weapon, and Japan surrendered. That was it. In this picture, There was no place for Dutch prisoners liberated by the blast, who then fight battles with other victims of that same blast. It introduced unnecessary, tragic, absurd notes into the narrative. It spoiled the clean victory. They had become a problem. Doctors examined them, but in a detached manner, as if they were lab animals. They were less interested in their health and more in how far from the epicenter they had been and what dose of the invisible fire they had received. The Dutchmen understood. Surviving hell had been only the first circle of their ordeal. The second circle, the encounter with the civilized world, proved to be no less cruel. Their rescue turned into a new prison, only this time the walls were not of barbed wire but of suspicion, mistrust, and political expediency. In the evening, the same intelligence captain came to Hendrik. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "we've checked your story. The ruins of the camp have been found. Your story, strange as it is confirmed. But the command has made a decision. In the official reports, you will be listed as having been liberated by our patrol from an undamaged camp. Everything else is to be forgotten." Hendrik looked at him and could not utter a word. "But Joris," he finally managed to say, "he died in combat." "Joris died of illness in the camp," the captain cut him off. "That will be the official version. And I strongly advise you to stick to it, for your own safety." In that moment, Hendrik knew they had lost. They had defeated hunger, thirst, the Japanese, but they had lost to the soulless machine of military bureaucracy. Their feat, their tragedy, their survival, all of it was erased, buried in secret archives. Their story was stolen. A few weeks later, they, along with other liberated prisoners, were sent home. The journey to Holland was long, but they barely noticed it. They sat on the deck of the transport ship, wrapped in American blankets, and remained silent. There was nothing to talk about. The most important thing had been said there, in the intelligence captain's office. Their story was not their own. They had signed non-disclosure agreements, and that signature weighed on their souls more heavily than all 3 years of captivity. Returning home brought no relief. The country was just beginning to rise from the ruins after the German occupation. No one had time for them. Yes, they were welcomed as heroes who had survived Japanese captivity, but no one knew, nor were they supposed to know, the true price of their survival. They tried to adapt to a peaceful life, but it was impossible. The war would not let them go. Hendrik van der Meer returned to his profession as an engineer. He built new dams and canals, rebuilding the country. He was a respected man, an expert, but every night he had the same dream: a crimson sky, a giant mushroom, and the eyes of the dying Joris. He tried to tell his story to his wife, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he explain to her that he had rejoiced at the deaths of his jailers and then killed men as unfortunate as himself just to get a sip of water? He took his secret to the grave, dying of a heart attack in 1972, quietly and unnoticed, just as the command had wanted. Willem, the brilliant chemist who had saved them from thirst, became a recluse after the war. He refused all scientific positions and settled in a small house on the coast. It was said that he had gone mad, that he would sit on the shore for hours, building complex structures out of sand and shells that resembled filters. He never spoke to anyone about the war. Not a word. Dan, the old sergeant, lived the longest. He received his military pension until his death, went to the same bar every day, drank his shot of Genever, and stared silently out the window. The locals considered him an eccentric. No one ever suspected that this quiet old man had survived 2 world wars and witnessed the birth of the atomic age. Klaus, the failed mutineer, returned to business and became successful again. He was the only one who managed to put it all out of his mind, or pretend that he had. He never met with the other members of the group, as if they had never existed. Nothing was ever known about the fate of Peter and the 20 men who went into the city. They vanished without a trace in the chaos and flames of Nagasaki. Most likely they died in the first few hours from the radiation, which could not be seen, but from which there was no escape. Their intoxication with freedom proved fatal. Their feat was officially forgotten. Their names are not carved on memorials. They became merely a statistical error in the Red Cross reports. But therein lies the most terrible paradox of their story. They survived the atomic fire. They conquered chaos by creating their own order. They fought and died. But upon returning home, they were defeated. Defeated by silence, oblivion, and lies. Their real war, the war for memory, was lost the very moment they were saved. And Hendrik, sitting at his drafting table in the evening, often thought, maybe it would have been better if that American patrol had never found them. Maybe it would have been better to stay there, in the mountains, kings of their own little empire of ashes, and die free, without ever knowing that their freedom was worthless to anyone. He buried this thought deep in his soul. But as his wife would recount after his death, sometimes he would wake up at night from his own scream, and in that scream there was always the same word: water. The official history of the Second World War is written on tons of paper and certified by dozens of signatures. It has a place for great battles, for generals' plans, and for diplomatic treaties. But it has almost no place for stories like that of Lieutenant van der Meer and his men. It is too inconvenient, too paradoxical, too human. It does not fit into the simple good versus evil narrative. But stories have an amazing quality. Even when buried alive in secret archives, they have a way of sprouting. Not as an official fact, but as something else, as a legend. Among the American soldiers who served and occupied Japan in the post-war years, a strange tale circulated. A soldier's legend told in whispers in bars after the third mug of beer. They said that ghosts inhabited the mountains above Nagasaki, the ghosts of tall blonde soldiers whom no one had ever seen, but traces of their presence were often found. Someone would find a strange construction of stones and charcoal, resembling a water filter. Someone else would stumble upon an abandoned cave where incomprehensible formulas were scratched on the wall. They said these were the souls of American pilots from a downed plane who had never found peace. No one could have guessed that this legend was the distorted, mythologized echo of the real story of the Dutch engineers. Their story of survival, stripped of names and surnames, turned into folklore, into a myth of how intellect and the will to live can conquer even a nuclear apocalypse. Was their struggle worth such sacrifices? Was survival worth the price of oblivion? There is no answer to this question. Hendrik van der Meer and his men were not heroes in the classic sense of the word. They did not win the war. They did not save the world. They merely survived. But in how they did it lies a great and tragic lesson. They showed that man's most powerful weapon is not a bomb capable of destroying a city, but a mind capable of building a water filter out of rubbish. They showed that the strongest prison is not walls of barbed wire, but a non-disclosure order. And they showed that the most terrible liberation is when you are freed by nuclear fire, and your saviors become your enemy. This story is not just a chronicle of a forgotten episode of the war. It is a reminder that behind every official report, behind every line in a textbook, lie thousands of untold human tragedies and feats. And the most important monument to those who survived the impossible is our memory. A memory that is stronger than any classified stamp.